Welcome to the Building Web3 Podcast. Today, my good friend Dennison. He is the CEO and co-founder of Tally. Before we get too deep into Tally, give us a brief background into yourself. How'd you get into this world of Web3?
Yeah, so great to be here, Jax. Thanks so much for having me. A little bit of background on myself. I've been in crypto for a very long time. I got started in 2011 when I read the Bitcoin white paper, and it really just sort of jumped out to me like, hey, this is the future. This is what's going to happen. Since then, I ran a Bitcoin exchange in the Czech Republic in 2012, did a hardware wallet in the early crypto days, did a number of other different things. I was an early employee at OpenZeppelin, the leading security firm in the blockchain space. Started a company called DApp Hero, which was sort of like abstraction layer on top of Web3 so that you could build dApps using only HTML. And then finally co-founded Tally with my friend and co-founder Raf Solari.
And then naturally that leads into what is Tally and what's the mission there?
What is Tally? What is the vision in there? So Tally is like one of these companies that's actually based on a kind of wild idea, right? Sometimes you're building a product or you're building a specific service. Tally is based on a really incredible idea that maybe corporations aren't the final state, right? Like maybe corporations aren't the final way that we implement, organizing humans and capital together to get really big things done. So when I like to think about like the history of, money and the evolution of the corporation in world history, you have all these like radical events and you get to like the Dutch East India Company. And then, you sort of go forward and you get like limited liability organizations. And today we have things like benefit corporations. And then what I see are decentralized organizations, right? Tally is based on this idea that we can build a better structure for organizations, that we can incorporate in software on the internet using blockchain. And because of this, we can reach new scales of organization that we weren't able to do before at vastly lower costs, with vastly larger reach. And primarily, a really big piece that sort of emerged over the years while we building Tally is that there's also an entirely new class of infrastructure, an entirely new class of company that needs the technology solutions that Tally offers, which are protocols. Things like Arbitrum, things like Wormhole and ZK Sync, these really large infrastructures that could potentially, house trillions of dollars of value. These things need to be operated in open, transparent ways, incredibly neutral ways. There's something I like to say that if you remember the whole saga with Facebook and Zynga, if you are building on Facebook, you're the next Zynga. And that speaks really importantly towards the place of Tally and protocol governance in the future of Web3, where you can't build on platforms, on infrastructure that isn't credibly neutral because you can't trust it, right? And if you hit some sort of scale, you have to always be worried that maybe the underlying layer will somehow work against your best interests or try and worst case, like what Facebook did with Zynga, actually steal your business. So Tally builds the tooling by which we can build these infrastructures that are so large, that could potentially be so large, but still continue to be these credibly neutral platforms that operate in ways that everyone understands.
And talk to us a little bit about first, let's define DAO, because I think we have a very sophisticated audience full of founders, but many people don't really dive in too much into the DAO space. So let's get a definition on DAOs and then how you guys hope to kind of improve the ecosystem.
Yeah, so, we start to move a little bit away from the sort of classical terminology of DAO, which is Decentralized Autonomous Organization, mostly because in practice, many DAOs, they're stronger on one letter than the other. Maybe they implement some of the characteristics. Maybe they implement none of the characteristics, and it's just all a scam. There's a lot of different ways that people interpret DAOs because, what is decentralized? What is autonomous? What is an organization? These are all actually very difficult to concretely and objectively define words. So we sort of like to talk a bit more about like protocol governance. How do you govern something, right? How do you operate it together? And what that looks like is things like, how do we collectively spend money? How do we collectively decide where we put revenues? How do we collectively decide to upgrade, right? Like when we think about things like blockchains and L2s and infrastructure layers, you have to think about, okay, there are many different ways to solve problems, some of which may benefit some folks more than others, some of which may have different drawbacks or different advantages than others, different costs, different security implications. And we need tools like Tally to be able to successfully intermediate the sort of political disputes that arise when we sort of make these incredibly important decisions for operating this kind of infrastructure. So if you sort of look at the sort of like typical kind of corporation, you have, like a CEO and, a team that sort of implements what they do. Well, decentralized organizations look a little bit different, right? Where they have stakeholders, people who have some sort of interest in the success of the system, and they need to collaborate together to make these decisions about how to move forward. Now, this is a very different kind of operating structure, right? Sometimes people are a little bit critical of them because they may not always be as decisive or, quote unquote, as efficient as sort of centralized organizations, but that's a trade-off you get from the decentralization and the security, right? The credible neutrality, right? In a regular, typical corporation, you have a CEO. I'm the CEO of Cali. I could pivot the company tomorrow to sell lemonade, right? And then the teams that have built upon us would be really in trouble based on that kind of decision, right? They have no access to the political influence necessary on ensuring the stability, the credible neutrality of the platform that they use, right? So as we move towards decentralization, right, Tally, I think, is a great example. We are in the process of decentralization. But if you look at like regular corporations, the idea is if you were to instead operate this as stakeholder managed infrastructure, then stakeholders would know that, we're not going to pivot to make lemonade tomorrow, right? They can say, okay, we are going to make large infrastructure investments building on top of this platform because we know what's going to happen tomorrow. And if there is some change, I, as a stakeholder, get to participate in it, right? And that manifests itself in very real ways, right? Like if you think about, Reddit, when they revoked access to the Reddit API, you had lots of people and businesses building on top of the Reddit API, but Reddit's business needs changed. They revoked access or changed the parameters of access to that API, which has downstream effects on the people building on that infrastructure. Same thing with Twitter. When Elon bought Twitter, the Twitter API was abruptly, had their terms and conditions and usages abruptly changed, right? Same thing with Facebook. I'm old enough to remember that there was a time when all instant messaging chat apps were interoperable, right? And you could have third-party clients that would let you, there was a time when there was a time when all chat apps were interoperable, and you had these super clients that would let you get your Skype, your Microsoft Instant Message, your AOL, your ICQ, all your different chats. All in one place. You could have a super app that would do that. But of course, over time, these companies all revoked that access and destroyed that sort of like credible neutrality, and of course, destroyed the business models of these people building on top of that, right? So if you think about, if there are traditional Web2 corporations listening to this, if you think about your business and you think about the future of it, are you building something that people can actually build on top of? And does your platform accrue value from the success of the underlying, right? This may be an ideal case to actually decentralize and turn it into a stakeholder-owned infrastructure, because at scale, you'll always be confronted with the challenge of, are these stakeholders, the downstream users and participants, aligned or misaligned with my personal sort of direction and interests, right? And that tension, that uncertainty filters down to the people building on top of it, so that, you don't see a lot of innovation that may actually drive value to what you're building, because people can't trust building on it.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story or not a story, but a real thing that happened between Google and Apple. Is Apple saw early days that parents would buy Androids for their kids and buy iPhones for themselves. So what Apple did is they made the messaging very difficult between the two, just like essentially threw in a bunch of friction. And it's so interesting you mentioned that like super app idea, these aggregators, because I was like, why isn't that a thing? That would be such a great idea. And because we have all this messaging app fragmentation now, that would just be so easily solved. But talk to us a little bit about how you then align incentives, because like if I'm, let's say I've got Jax protocol, my value. Like, yeah, I like having builders, but if I could swallow up some builders, guys, I'm not speaking against myself right now, but if people could swallow up some builders like Facebook did, like they're probably always going to make that move. How do we align the incentives better between the builders and the, I would call them the ecosystems?
Yeah, I mean, this is where decentralization comes in, right? Where, if you remember, Google used to have a motto, which was "Don't be evil," and in perhaps one of the weirdest things that you can kind of imagine, they like elected to remove that. Right? They like actually said, no, that really doesn't encompass what we're doing here anymore. We really ought to like change it. Like, we're no longer saying don't be evil, but we're also no longer want to lie to you about what we're doing, right? So the tension that you describe is real, and in a decentralized infrastructure, right, you have these stakeholders, and you need to align them, right? And this creates a different sort of vision. This is kind of a different operating model. If Jax protocol is the embodiment of you, and it is sort of forever to be determined by you, and that's sort of your vision and intention, decentralization might not be for you, right? But I would argue that then Jax protocol's limit is probably pretty narrowly scoped to the level of trust that people are willing to put in you. Will they build on top of your protocol, or will they build a parallel infrastructure to you, right? Like, is the risk of trusting you as a centralized entity too great for them to build on top of it? Maybe, right? Certainly different DeFi protocols have different needs, censorship resistance, sovereign resistance, these type of things, where you wouldn't build on somebody's database, right? There's a world of difference from what you can do building on top of PayPal than what you can do building on top of USDC with what you can do building on top of ETH. Right. So there's a lot of like considerations that go into like, okay, should what I build be decentralized? But generally, I think a great way to think about it is, do third parties build valuable applications on top of my infrastructure? Will there be diversity among these applications? Meaning, will there be many different kinds? And will these applications, third-party applications, be able to grow to any size, right? And this is an important consideration because, for example, if what you're building doesn't lend itself to a garden of various different types of third-party infrastructure projects, you very quickly get into this centralization concern reason, right? Like, let's say you're building some sort of infrastructure, maybe it's going okay, right? Maybe you haven't figured out exactly how to monetize it, or how to do it correctly, or something like that. Or maybe you have monetization that comes from third parties, but there's one third party in particular that's going gangbusters, and it's built on your infrastructure. Well, now you're going to be thrust into a situation where you very quickly get jealous of the third-party infrastructure, right? Because you have two things that go on here. One, you as the provider of the centralized infrastructure get jealous of the third party that's built on it, but the third party gets scared that you get jealous of them. So what you end up having is that the centralized entity works to steal the opportunity that the third party has created, and the third party works to replace the infrastructure that they're building on so that they can bring it under their own control and own it, right? So what you see there is that naturally there's going to be some limit to the economic success of that relationship. Now, if you're building a centralized entity and you have a garden, and there's many different people building on the infrastructure, and many different teams are very successful, well, now you're in a different kind of situation, right? It would be better to be decentralized here, right? Because now these stakeholders can align between one another, because they will get a little bit jealous of one another. They'll be concerned about, well, is this other competitor to me going to somehow encroach on my business, right? Is it going to become winner take all? But you as a centralized entity, ideally transitioning into a decentralized entity, you have a different kind of relationship here, right? If you're centralized, you may want to go after each one by one and steal their business, right? The sort of way that Facebook went from letting you build things like Farmville to them building Game Center or whatever it was called on Facebook, and then sort of centralizing power through there. Or you look towards finding a way that all of these, the garden sort of flourishes, because now you are finding your success by actually providing infrastructure. You're not actually in a situation where you need to derive value by taking over any one of these entities. Now, if you're centralized, you may still be tempted to take over any one of these entities. But if you're decentralized, well, now actually these parties coordinate to say, hey, there's 10 of us, we've got this big garden, we're building all this great value. We would do better if we had X, Y, and Z. And everyone can come to say, yeah, you know what? Actually, we all agree collectively this is good for everyone's business. Let's do this, right? And now you have infrastructure that's like collectively managed. And as founders, right, you become more of like a service provider to this ecosystem, but you derive your value because you can focus on saying, okay, we are just going to drive value for the ecosystem, this garden that builds on it, so that they drive value back to this protocol, and then we're all successful. So it's a very different model long-term, right? In the garden idea, you can really scale to any size, right? There's no limit. You know, you think about Ethereum, there's no upper bound of like how much value you can capture. But as a centralized entity, there's a natural point at which the success of the follow-on sort of like third-party things comes at the expense of the centralized entity, and there's a natural tension that builds up there in sort of like a mutual distrust.
Mm-hmm. And then talk to us a little bit about, because this just popped into my mind, it's about the like tragedy of the commons. Oftentimes when there's like a centralized person running things, they have a high incentive to improve. Even they can cannibalize, but they can also improve. We can think about like public parks can often become very like nasty because no one actually feels ownership of the park itself. Talk to us a little bit about like the underlying constituents and their relationship to the ecosystem once decentralization fully occurs.
Yeah, so tragedies of the commons is a really interesting problem, right? Mostly it comes from political inefficiency and misalignment of incentives. I don't actually think that the park problem is very accurate because, especially in the United States, parks are, the funding for parks is deeply tied to like a legacy of racism and inequality, right? Same thing with things like public schools, right? There's structural systems that have been put in place over decades, and in the United States, actually centuries, that prevent the commons being equally funded because there are structural mechanisms put in place to ensure that tax funds aren't actually uniformly distributed, right? Instead, they're concentrated around certain groups. And you may see this also in things like protocols. Additionally, though, there are aspects of the commons in the decentralized space where one has to ask, are we talking about something that's a public good, or are we talking about something that's a nice to have? Right? Because things that are nice to have get done in people's free time. Things that are must-haves get done because they're critical to move forward. And I think in the case of like blockchains and protocols, this is actually the job of sort of this like core founding team to build the must-haves and maybe even build the nice-to-haves, right? Because their business shifts from capturing all the value everywhere to maintaining the infrastructure that enables this value everywhere. And thus, there's an opportunity to capture value from that, right? So they should be incentivized to build this fundamental tooling, these sort of like public goods that you may need. I think the other thing that's important to know is that sometimes we fund public goods and we don't realize that we destroy private sector opportunity. I think a perfect example is throughout the 80s and 90s, and probably still today, people would collect up used clothing in America and put it in cargo ships and send it to Africa because the poor Africans, they don't have anything to wear, right? Kind of the same thing with like bottled water, right? People would like send bottled water and ship all this stuff over to help these poor people. Well, what actually happened was we destroyed local private industry, right? You dump all this like free cheap clothing on places that already do have, native local industries, and you actually destroy these businesses, right? So there's this idea of like, okay, public goods that you give away some sort of infrastructure, but you actually destroy the ability for someone to build a business around it. And what happens there is that now people become dependent, or ecosystems become dependent on this, cargo ship full of like free somebody else's trash that just gets dumped on them. And they don't have the ability to reinvest in building up a sustainable ecosystem that develops it for themselves. And of course, the trade analogy has a lot of other problems that are going on in the world that are related to that: tariffs, subsidies, all this other stuff that impacts this. But if you think about it from the the Web3 space, I think the best example is grants, right? People give grants for public goods. But what you end up having is you never have a virtuous cycle of reinvestment and redevelopment. You pay for something that ostensibly you think everybody wants. It gets built, but now that it's public good, there isn't an opportunity for it to actually capture value. So you can't actually improve it. You can't actually make it better. It's sort of like always dependent on this detached funding, right? Which has these targets of what they would like to see, but the reality is that these sort of abstract ideas of what are necessary in public goods very rarely match up with what the ecosystem actually needs. And you see that where people are trying to measure the impact of grants, for example, and it always comes out pretty dismal, or there isn't a long-term thing. So I really push back on the idea of like tragedy of the commons, because there are many things that we think are necessary, but aren't. And I think the people will say, well, what about water? And the thing is like, well, we pay taxes for water, and people say, well, yeah, that's public good. But no, if New York City didn't have great water, and it didn't have great streets and didn't have great fire, right? Like if the product, New York City, the product wasn't good enough, well, then the company, New York City, the entity would lose me as a customer, right? But so I think like it's the that scales up. If the parks are bad enough long enough, you'll lose all the families, right? And you lose the families, you lose the tax revenue, like goes downward spiral. Which I grew up in a Rust Belt city. I know very well how this works. And then you just require some sort of change to start that economic engine over again. But at the end of the day, I'm a pretty as much as decentralization and DAOs can come across as being like kind of socialist, I'm very, very much a market forces person. I think that free markets do a lot to help identify value and reinforce value when done correctly.
Yeah, to me, it's very interesting because each blockchain ecosystem, viewed from the top down, is essentially creating like a new city state with its own currency, with its own like, hey, we need builders to build here. So like, yeah, of course, we got to build, like, you would call them like tax breaks here. We would call them like grants. And it's very difficult because you worry about like, hey, are we just creating like a bunch of like Chinese ghost cities? Or I'm sure that ghost cities exist in other places, but that's the one I know. So it's like, are we just creating all these like disparate ghost cities? So talk to us a little bit about like how Tally kind of enables better governance, because blockchain to me is this giant experiment in like currency governance in a different model. So talk to us a little bit about how you guys are like, what features you're building to help enable these ecosystems.
Well, the first thing that's most important to think about is transparency, right? Governance doesn't work if you don't have any idea what's going on and who's participating in it, right? That's the number one thing that Tally tackles: transparency. You even know that there's a vote going on. There's a great, the book Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy opens with, Earth is about to be destroyed because they're going to build some intergalactic superhighway through it. And, Earthlings are like kind of upset about this. And, the space empire is like, well, we posted a notice on the bulletin board. You had opportunity to comment, but you didn't comment, right? That's like a real danger, right? There's elections, you didn't know. There's votes, you didn't know. There's proposals, you didn't know. Who's even running, right? This kind of education is core to the functioning and operation of governance. So Tally's core mission is the transparency, right, of these organizations. Because from transparency comes accountability, comes participation, comes opportunity, right? Like these things won't operate without transparency. So we have lots of great tools. We have the best-in-class tools for transparency, understanding who's participating. Protocols that launch with us, they're more than 10 times, they're 10 times more successful than other teams that launch using comparable products. We work really hard at growing this garden of contributors who participate and operate your protocol, giving rich detail to how they act and participate. We have excellent tooling around creating proposals to democratize the ability to create proposals. There's many organizations out there that either entirely restrict people from being able to create proposals, or have proposal creation systems that are so Byzantine and complex that no one can create a proposal anyway, right? Capture can also come from complexity. And we make it simple, right? We try and eliminate the points of capture so that you can have truly functioning, fluid, dynamic ecosystems. And we build, a really incredible suite of tools around this that allow you to do things like launch your protocol, find the participants, delegate registration, histories, transparency. You can vote for security councils, so you have this democratic executive power mechanism. No code proposals, the ability to sync through and diff check the history of proposals to make sure that people aren't changing things in between the steps of the proposal process. Gasless voting, supportive custodians so that large investors can participate via their partners. We just launched MultiGov in partnership with Wormhole. So now your protocol can control it across the multi-chain, right? Including Solana. So, the feature list of Tally is almost too long to really enumerate, but really it all starts from transparency. It goes from ease of use. We make it simple, we make it clear, but it's also at the same time true decentralization, right? The things that are created on Tally actually execute on chain. These aren't signal votes. These aren't, opinion pieces. These are real large organizations working together to do big things.
Yeah, because you guys are kind of targeting, like you mentioned, Wormhole, so very big, changes, wide scale changes. What challenges have you guys faced trying to get this adopted or building it? What was it? Marketing? Was it engineering? Was it just getting people aligned around this idea?
Yeah, so there are no lack of challenges in the DAO space. So you name it, we have to deal with it and face it. Mostly, what we do is we are very customer led as a company. What we try and do is we see what our customers need and we build that, right? We find clients for all the things that we build so that we have a first customer. Many DAO teams, several years ago kind of built these clouds in the sky around ideas that no one actually asked for, and in the end, actually no one needed. So we're very conscious of being guided by our vision and North Star that we're really revolutionizing human organization, but very specifically the steps that we take are led by the people who are at the frontier of this transition and who need these tools and changes first. So we really listen closely to them.
Absolutely. And talk to us a little bit about who are some of your guys' partners, just to put.
Yeah, so our partner list is in the hundreds, so I definitely couldn't run through all of it. I think some of the larger, more famous organizations are Arbitrum, Uniswap, ZK Sync, Wormhole, folks like that. There are many others, and I apologize to everyone else that I'm not able to enumerate. But there are so many on the platform that if you go to tally.xyz, you can explore. I think we support something like 60 different networks, right? So, there's so many different ecosystems that we serve and can serve. So yeah, quite a lot.
And then you've been in the blockchain space for a while. Our goal is to get more builders and more founders into this space. Can you give a little advice on if somebody wants to build in Web3, what kind of advice would you give them as a founder?
Yeah, so I think this is really hard because building Web3 is actually hard. It's legit hard. And every time people say it's gotten so easy, it's actually just a new level of hard. So I would say kind of understanding why you want to build in Web3 is probably core. Are you trying to build something that's Web 2 and add Web3 spice to it? Is this something that you couldn't build any other way? I think it's important to think about from the beginning, really why you want to build what it is that you want to build. Many builders come here because they just enjoy the experience of just trying new stuff and hacking away and then, finding a job somewhere else. I think in that case, build a little project, ask ChatGPT and Claude to give you an idea to get started with, experiment and learn. There is so much here that is always changing. You have to really stay on your toes. But I can't lie, it's hard. It's still hard, right? We've been building the space. It is hard. So, but that's not to deter anyone. It's just to say that the opportunity rewards you for the challenges that you have to overcome.
Yeah, I always think back. This is not an original quote. I've heard this from many people. My mom always said, she was a judge. She was like, if people had told me how hard it would have been to get elected, I would have never done it. But she's like, I'm so happy nobody ever told me how truly difficult it would be. Are there any areas of Web3, because we're always looking to give like some builders, startup ideas. Are there any challenges you feel like are under-resourced or under-addressed in the crypto space that, you think would be like, hey, if I wasn't working on Tally, I'd love to tackle this problem?
Yeah, there are a lot of them. I think the biggest thing that always stands out to me is how hard Web3 is to use in practice. I was just like sending funds the other day and it was just like miserable experience, so difficult. And everyone knows this and everyone goes out and builds a solution and somehow they don't solve the miserable hard part. And it's just like another form of miserable and hard. So I don't know what it is, and I'm really tempted. I would really love to be able to try and solve it myself because there must be some sort of like siren out there on the seas of development that just like sings to you. You start out on your ship and you're rowing and you have this clear idea of this simple UX and just like, buttery smooth Web 2 experience and no one ever notices anything. And it just operates how they expect. And somehow you just end up crashing on the rocks of these sirens. And suddenly your product's got all these like pop-ups and you're confirming, byte code and, you don't understand what's happening. And then, you get hacked and lose all your money. So I don't know what it is, but we always seem to head down that path. And, every time people solve it, it seems like it just like creates a different sort of set of problems that are just miserable. So, I think that I would want to try and solve that simply because I'm convinced, and maybe not correctly so, that I would not fall for it. But, maybe I would, and I want to know what happens when you just veer off course like that.
I'm becoming more, I don't know, like I'll call it like green pilled on UX stuff, because in the past, like I was very black pilled. I was like, okay, like you had to add contract addresses if you send certain kinds of funds. You're greeted with some scary seed phrase that like, hey, if somebody finds this, you're screwed. But now with like account abstraction and they're even having gas abstraction intents. Now people can just say what they want to do. So I'm bullish on this space. I think it will still take like 2 years to rectify a lot of the UX problems. I think one of the biggest problems we'll have to probably address is like, you'll see stuff from Jesse. Love that team, but like on chain. It's like, well, like, does everything have to be on chain? Like what actually deserves to be on chain? Maybe, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that, but I think my mom never goes to a website and is like, oh wow, they use MongoDB here. She just uses it. It's better. Like we just have to build better experiences. So TBD on all of that.
All of that.
Yeah. So finally, where can people learn more about Tally, like get involved with you online?
The best place to learn more about us and get involved is at our website, tally.xyz. We have a lot of great resources. We also have a great podcast. We have a newsletter. We produce a lot of content. We have a Twitter as well. So it's great to get started by following us there.
Awesome. Well, everyone go get involved with the team there, and I'm excited to see what you guys all produce. Let's continue building the future of Web3.